John Wayne Gacy murdered 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978. He raped them, tortured them, and strangled them to death in his suburban Chicago home. Then he buried 29 of their bodies in the crawl space beneath his house, stacking them like cordwood in shallow graves dug into the dirt floor. The remaining 4 he dumped in the Des Plaines River when he ran out of burial space. For 6 years, while those bodies decomposed beneath his feet, John Wayne Gacy lived what appeared to be an exemplary life. He was a successful businessman, a community leader, a Democratic Party precinct captain who once shook hands with First Lady Rosalynn Carter. He organized charity fundraisers, volunteered at children's hospitals, and dressed as Pogo the Clown to entertain sick children at neighborhood birthday parties. How could a man who brought smiles to children's faces be responsible for such unimaginable horror? How did nobody notice what was happening in that ordinary suburban house? But the question that truly haunts us is this: why did he do it? Stay until the end of this video, because this terrifying story will freeze your blood. To truly understand everything, we need to go back to the very beginning. John Wayne Gacy woke before dawn, as he always did. The alarm hadn't even gone off yet, but his eyes opened automatically at 5:30, the internal clock he'd developed through years of discipline and ambition. He lay there for a moment in the darkness of his bedroom, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him, the quiet breathing of his wife beside him, the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. At 36 years old, Gacy was finally becoming the man he'd always known he could be. The man his father said he'd never amount to, the man who could make something of himself, who could be respected, who could matter. He rose quietly, careful not to wake Marlon, and padded to the bathroom. The face that looked back at him from the mirror was ordinary in almost every way. Brown hair thinning slightly at the temples. A somewhat round face that made him look younger and more approachable than his years suggested. Eyes that could crinkle warmly when he smiled, which he did often. This was the face of a successful businessman, a community leader, a man people trusted, and they did trust him. In the few years since he'd moved to Waterloo, Iowa, Gacy had built an impressive reputation. He managed 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants for his father-in-law, and he managed them well. The stores were clean, efficient, profitable. Gacy was known as a hard worker, someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, who would work 18-hour days if that's what it took to get the job done. But more than that, he'd become a pillar of the community. He joined the JCs, the Junior Chamber of Commerce, and thrown himself into their activities with characteristic intensity. He organized fundraisers, volunteered for community projects, served on committees. Within a year, he'd been named an outstanding vice president of the Waterloo JCs. People spoke highly of him. John Gacy gets things done, they said. John Gacy cares about this community. John Gacy is going places. He dressed carefully that morning, as he always did. A clean white shirt, pressed pants, shoes polished until they gleamed. Appearance mattered. First impressions mattered. Gacy understood this instinctively. If you looked successful, if you looked competent, if you looked trustworthy, people would believe you were all those things. And once they believed it, you could make it true. Downstairs, he made coffee and reviewed his schedule for the day. A meeting with suppliers in the morning, lunch with a potential investor who was interested in expanding the restaurant business, an evening JC's meeting where they'd be planning the upcoming community festival. It was going to be another long day, but Gacy thrived on the busyness, the constant motion, the sense that he was building something important. What none of his colleagues knew, what his wife didn't know, what the community leaders who shook his hand and praised his civic dedication didn't know, was that John Wayne Gacy was already a predator. The darkness was already there, coiled inside him like a snake, waiting for opportunities to strike. The first signs had appeared years earlier, but Gacy had always been skilled at hiding things, at presenting the face people wanted to see while keeping his true nature carefully concealed. Even he didn't fully understand it yet, this compulsion that drove him. He only knew that certain desires, certain urges would surface at unexpected moments, demanding satisfaction. In Waterloo, he'd found ways to feed those urges while maintaining his respectable facade. He'd convinced several teenage boys who worked at his restaurants to come to his home for special training sessions or business discussions. He'd offer them alcohol, get them drunk, then make his moves. Some had been too frightened or confused to resist. Others had reported him, but Gacy was a respected businessman, a community leader, who would believe troubled teenagers over him. But in 1968, his carefully constructed world began to crack. One of the boys he'd assaulted, a 15-year-old named Donald Voorhees, finally told his father what had happened. And Donald's father, unlike some others, believed his son. He went to the police. He demanded action. He refused to be silenced or intimidated. The investigation moved slowly at first. Gacy was well-connected, well-liked. The police were reluctant to believe the accusations, but as they dug deeper, more victims came forward. The evidence mounted, and finally in December 1968, John Wayne Gacy was arrested and charged with sodomy. The mask slipped. The community was shocked. How could this be the same John Gacy they knew? The one who organized charity events and worked tirelessly for local causes. There had to be some mistake. These boys must be lying. But the evidence was overwhelming. Gacy had been careful in some ways, but not careful enough. In the courtroom, facing the ruin of everything he'd built, Gacy showed no remorse. He was defiant, indignant, convinced that he was the victim of a conspiracy. When the judge sentenced him to 10 years in the Iowa State Men's Reformatory at Anamosa, Gacy's face remained impassive. He'd serve his time, he'd get out, he'd start over. He was good at starting over. His wife filed for divorce before the ink on the sentencing papers was dry. His father-in-law wanted nothing more to do with him. The Jaycees revoked his membership. The community that had once embraced him now recoiled in disgust. Everything John Wayne Gacy had worked for was gone. But something unexpected happened in prison. Gacy became a model inmate. He worked in the kitchen, joined the prison Jaycees chapter, organized events and activities. He convinced the prison psychologists that he was reformed, that his crimes had been the result of temporary lapses in judgment, that he'd learned his lesson. He was so convincing that after serving just 18 months of his 10-year sentence, John Wayne Gacy was paroled. 18 months, for multiple sexual assaults on children. The system had failed to recognize what it was releasing back into the world. In 1971, Gacy moved to Chicago, to a quiet suburb called Norwood Park Township, far enough from Waterloo that most people wouldn't know his history, close enough to the city that he could disappear into the anonymity of urban life when needed. It was perfect. He bought a small ranch house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, with money borrowed from his mother. The house was unremarkable, single-story, modest, with a small garage and a patch of lawn. But it was his. A fresh start, a clean slate, a chance to rebuild. And rebuild he did, with the same manic energy he'd brought to everything else in his life. He started a construction company, PDM Contractors, which stood for painting, decorating, and maintenance. He was good with his hands, good at managing people, good at getting work done quickly and professionally. The business grew steadily. He remarried in 1972 to a woman named Carole Hoff, a divorcee with 2 young daughters. Carole thought John was wonderful, hard-working, ambitious, good with her daughters. He seemed to genuinely care about creating a stable family life. He didn't tell her about Iowa. Why burden her with a past he'd left behind? Gacy threw himself into community involvement again. He joined the local Democratic Party organization, became a precinct captain, organized events and fundraisers. He was photographed with politicians, including First Lady Rosalind Carter, at a political event. He joined the Moose Lodge. He volunteered for local charities. And then there was Pogo the Clown. In 1975, Gacy joined a local community organization called the Jolly Jokers. They dressed as clowns and performed at children's hospitals, charity events, neighborhood parties. Gacy created his own clown character, Pogo the Clown, with his colorful costume, painted smile, and cheerful demeanor. Children loved Pogo, parents trusted him. He was giving back to the community, bringing joy to sick children, being a positive force. Nobody knew that John Wayne Gacy had discovered the perfect disguise. The clown makeup did something for him. It was a mask that allowed him to be whoever he wanted to be, to hide everything dark and twisted behind that painted smile. When he was Pogo, he could get close to children and teenagers without suspicion. He could be in their homes, at their parties, earning their trust. The clown was perfect camouflage for a predator. But Gacy's targets weren't the children he entertained at parties. They were teenage boys and young men, usually vulnerable ones, runaways, hitchhikers, boys from troubled homes, young men looking for work. He'd pick them up with promises of jobs at his construction company. He'd lure them to his house with offers of money, or drugs or alcohol. And once they were inside 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, many of them would never leave. The first murder likely occurred in 1972, not long after Gacy moved to Chicago. Though the exact date would never be confirmed, the victim was probably a teenage boy, probably someone nobody would miss immediately, someone whose disappearance wouldn't trigger an immediate investigation. Gacy developed a method, a ritual that he would refine and repeat, with horrifying consistency over the next 6 years. He'd lure young men to his house, usually with the promise of construction work or simply a place to stay for the night. He'd offer them alcohol or marijuana, get them relaxed and off guard. Then he'd make his move. He'd show them what he called the handcuff trick, a magic trick where he'd demonstrate how to escape from handcuffs. He'd put the cuffs on himself, slip out of them, then offer to show the victim how it was done. But once the handcuffs were on the young man's wrists, there was no escape. The trick was that there was no trick. The cuffs were real, and Gacy had the only key. What happened next was always similar in its horror. Gacy would torture his victims, sometimes for hours. He'd assault them. He'd tell them in detail what he was going to do to them, how they were going to die, how nobody would find them. He'd watch their terror and feed on it. And then he'd kill them, usually by strangulation, using either his hands or a rope or a board with a rope attached that he'd twist like a tourniquet. He called it the rope trick. He'd watch as the life drained from their eyes, as their struggles weakened and finally ceased. And when it was over, when they were dead, he'd drag the bodies down to his crawl space. The crawl space beneath Gacy's house was a narrow, dark cavity between the floor joists and the earth, only about 3 feet high in most places. It was damp and cold, accessed through a trapdoor in the hallway closet. Most homeowners use such spaces for storage or utilities. John Wayne Gacy used his as a graveyard. He'd dig shallow graves in the dirt floor, working in the cramped darkness by flashlight. He'd bury the bodies, sometimes 2 or 3 to a trench, covering them with lime to speed decomposition and mask the smell. Then he'd go back upstairs, clean up any evidence, and continue his life, as if nothing had happened. The house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue became a tomb. The boys and young men who disappeared into that house came from everywhere and nowhere. Some were runaways who'd never be reported missing. Others were drifters, hitchhikers passing through Chicago on their way to somewhere else. A few were local kids from troubled homes, the kind whose parents might assume they'd simply run away again when they didn't come home. This was Gacy's genius, if such an evil thing can be called genius. He understood which victims the system wouldn't look for very hard. He had an instinct for vulnerability, for spotting the boys who existed on the margins, who wouldn't be immediately missed, whose disappearances might not even be connected to each other by police. Some he'd hired to work for PDM contractors. He was always looking for workers, always willing to give jobs to young men who needed money. It was the perfect cover. If anyone asked about a boy who'd been at his house, he could say he'd offered him a job but the kid had never showed up for work. Unreliable. Probably moved on to another city. These kids were always moving on. By 1975, there were at least a dozen bodies buried in the crawl space, packed in so tightly that Gacy was running out of room. The smell was becoming a problem. Neighbors occasionally mentioned an odor, especially during warm weather, but Gacy always had an explanation ready. There was moisture in the crawl space, he'd say, probably mold or mildew, or it was the sewer line. He'd just had it serviced. Or it was something dead, a rat or a raccoon that had crawled under the house and died. People believed him because they had no reason not to. His marriage to Carol began to deteriorate. She noticed things, the smell in the house that never quite went away, no matter how much he cleaned. The fact that he'd often be gone all night, coming home at dawn with no real explanation. The boys who were always around, the ones he'd hire and who'd sometimes stay at the house, the way he'd become increasingly distant, irritable, controlling. Carol would later say that their sex life had become virtually non-existent. Gacy would make excuses. He was tired, stressed from work, not feeling well. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that John Wayne Gacy had no interest in adult women. His desires lay elsewhere entirely. They divorced in 1976, and Carol moved out with her daughters. This was actually perfect for Gacy. Now he had the house completely to himself. No one to question his strange hours, his unusual visitors, the sounds that might come from the basement in the middle of the night. The house at 8213 West Summerdale became his private kingdom, where he could indulge his darkest impulses without interference. After his divorce, something seemed to break loose inside Gacy. The kills came more frequently. Where he might have murdered 2 or 3 boys a year before, now it was one every few months, then one every few weeks. By 1977 and 1978, he was killing with shocking regularity, sometimes with only days between murders. The crawl space was full. He'd buried bodies in every available space under the house, layering them on top of each other when necessary. The smell had become overwhelming. He'd pour gallons of lime down there, spray chemicals, cover the trapdoor with a concrete slab and carpet, but nothing could completely mask the stench of decomposition. When there was no more room in the crawl space, Gacy began dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River. He'd drive out late at night with a body in his car, find a secluded spot along the riverbank, and throw the corpse into the water, weighted down with rocks or chains to keep it from surfacing. At least 5 bodies were disposed of this way, though only 4 were ever recovered. But Gacy was getting sloppy. The kills were happening so frequently now that he couldn't maintain the careful protocols he'd once followed. He was leaving evidence, making mistakes, and eventually those mistakes would catch up with him. December 11, 1978, started as a routine day for 15-year-old Robert Piest. He worked part-time at a pharmacy in Des Plaines, a Chicago suburb, earning money for Christmas gifts and saving for college. He was a good kid, quiet, responsible, close to his family. He had plans that night to celebrate his mother's birthday. That evening, a customer came into the pharmacy. A heavy-set man in his mid-30s, friendly and talkative. He'd been doing some contracting work at the pharmacy and struck up a conversation with Robert. The man mentioned that he owned a construction company, that he was looking for workers, that he could pay much better than what the pharmacy was paying. Would Robert be interested in discussing a job? Robert was interested. He told his mother, who'd come to pick him up, that he was going to talk to this contractor about a summer job and would be back in a few minutes. He asked her to wait. "I'll be right back," he said. "This will just take a minute." His mother waited. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 20. 30 minutes passed. An hour. Robert Piest never came back. When Mrs. Piest finally went into the pharmacy to look for her son, he was gone. The manager said he'd left with a contractor named John Gacy, who'd been doing some work in the store. They'd walked out together about an hour ago. Nobody had seen them since. Mrs. Piest knew immediately that something was wrong. Robert wouldn't just leave without telling her. He wouldn't miss his mother's birthday dinner. Something had happened. She called the police. Detective Lieutenant Joseph Kozenjak of the Des Plaines Police Department took the call. Missing teenager, last seen with a local contractor. It was probably nothing. The kid had probably gone off with friends and lost track of time. But Kozenjak was thorough. He decided to check out this John Gacy character, just to rule him out. What he found disturbed him. John Wayne Gacy had a record. A 1968 conviction in Iowa for sexually assaulting a teenage boy. 10-year sentence. Paroled after 18 months, now living in Des Plaines, running a construction business, working with young men. Kozenjak's instincts began screaming. This wasn't a routine missing person case. This was something else entirely. He contacted Gacy that same night, asked him to come to the police station for questioning. Gacy came willingly, all cooperation and concern. He remembered Robert Piest, he said. Nice kid. They'd talked about a potential summer job. But Robert had decided he wasn't interested and left. Gacy had no idea where he'd gone after that. Maybe he'd run away. These teenagers, you never knew what they were thinking. Kozenjak didn't believe him. Everything about Gacy's demeanor, his story, his background, set off alarm bells. But he had no evidence, no proof. Just a gut feeling that this man was lying, that he knew exactly what had happened to Robert Piest. He decided to dig deeper. Over the next few days, Kozenjak and his team pulled together everything they could find on John Wayne Gacy. His conviction in Iowa, his construction business, the various young men who'd worked for him over the years. And as they investigated, they began to notice something disturbing. Young men who'd worked for Gacy had a tendency to disappear. Not all of them, but some. They'd work for him for a few weeks or months, and then they'd vanish. Their families would report them missing. The police would investigate briefly, conclude the young man had probably run away or moved to another city, and close the case. Nobody had ever connected these disappearances to each other, or to Gacy. Until now, Kozenjak requested permission to search Gacy's house. The request was denied, insufficient probable cause. But the detective wasn't about to give up. If he couldn't search the house, he'd put Gacy under 24-hour surveillance. Maybe the man would make a mistake, lead them to evidence, do something that would give them the cause they needed for a search warrant. For 3 weeks, teams of police officers followed John Wayne Gacy everywhere he went. They sat outside his house. They followed him to work sites. They documented his movements, his contacts, everything. And Gacy knew they were there. He'd wave at them, offer them coffee, make jokes about his police escort. But underneath the friendly facade, he was unraveling. The pressure was getting to him. He couldn't kill with police watching his every move. He couldn't dispose of bodies. He couldn't do anything without being seen. And the smell in his house was getting worse. The bodies had been there for months, some for years. In the December cold, the smell was less noticeable, but it was still there, still threatening to reveal his secrets. Gacy's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd leave his house at strange hours, driving aimlessly around the city with police cars following close behind. He'd show up at the police station, ranting about harassment, threatening lawsuits. He'd call Kozenjak in the middle of the night, sometimes crying, sometimes angry, demanding to know when this surveillance would end. And then on December 20th, 1978, Kozenjak finally got what he needed. A judge signed a second search warrant for Gacy's house, this time based on accumulated evidence, the Iowa conviction, the connection to multiple missing young men, suspicious behavior, inconsistent statements about Robert Piest. It was enough. On December 21st, 1978, police entered 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. The investigators came prepared for a routine search. They were looking for evidence connecting Gacy to Robert Piest's disappearance. Maybe they'd find the boy's wallet, his jacket, something that would prove Gacy was lying about their interaction. What they found instead was beyond anything they could have imagined. The smell hit them the moment they entered. It was overwhelming, nauseating, a stench that immediately identified itself as decomposition. Something was dead in this house. Many somethings. The search team moved through the rooms methodically, documenting everything. They found class rings belonging to various young men who'd been reported missing. They found driver's licenses, identification cards, clothing, personal items that had no reason to be there, unless Gacy had taken them from his victims as trophies. And then they found the trapdoor to the crawl space. One of the investigators pulled up the carpet and moved the concrete slab that Gacy had placed over the entrance. The smell that emerged was indescribable, thick, cloying, unmistakable. The smell of death, concentrated and inescapable. They shone flashlights into the darkness below. At first they saw nothing but dirt and support beams. But as their eyes adjusted, they began to make out shapes in the earth. Irregular mounds. Depressions, signs of recent digging. "We need the forensic team," someone said quietly. Now, over the next several days, forensic investigators would excavate the crawl space under John Wayne Gacy's house. Working in the cramped, fetid darkness, they would uncover body after body after body. Some were skeletal remains, reduced to bones after years underground. Others were more recently deceased, still in various stages of decomposition. The bodies were packed in tightly, sometimes layered on top of each other. In some spots, 3 or 4 corpses had been buried in the same shallow trench. Gacy had used every available inch of space under that house, turning it into a mass grave. As the count climbed, 10 bodies, 15, 20, the investigators realized they were dealing with something unprecedented. This wasn't just a murder. This was a serial killer who'd operated for years, who'd killed dozens of young men, who'd buried them beneath his house, where he'd lived his ordinary life, eating dinner, watching television, sleeping, while dead bodies rotted in the earth below. The media descended on West Somerdale Avenue with an intensity that transformed the quiet suburban street into a circus of cameras, reporters, and satellite trucks. News helicopters circled overhead from dawn until dark, their cameras trained on the modest ranch house that had become one of the most notorious addresses in American history. Reporters lined the street 3 and 4 deep, their equipment clogging the narrow roadway, their presence turning what had been an anonymous neighborhood into ground zero for one of the most shocking crime stories the nation had ever seen. Television networks interrupted regular programming with updates that grew more horrifying each day as the body count climbed. International media picked up the story. John Wayne Gacy became, almost overnight, one of the most infamous names in the world. Neighbors stood in clusters on their lawns, bundled against the December cold, watching in stunned disbelief as body after body was carried from the house, where many of them had attended barbecues and holiday parties. They spoke in hushed, shocked voices about the man they thought they'd known. John Gacy, who'd helped Mrs. Henderson repair her fence last summer. John Gacy, who'd organized the block party in July. John Gacy, who'd dressed as Pogo the Clown and made balloon animals at children's birthday parties. How could that friendly neighbor be the same man who'd murdered and buried nearly 30 people beneath his floor? He seemed so normal, they kept saying, as if repetition might make the incomprehensible make sense. He was always so friendly. He invited us over for dinner. He helped with our groceries. He was just a regular guy. How could we not know? But there had been nothing obvious to see. Gacy had been extraordinarily skilled at compartmentalizing his life, at maintaining the facade of normalcy even as he committed atrocities. During the day, he ran his construction business with efficiency and professionalism. In the evenings he attended community meetings and volunteered at charitable events. And late at night, he became something else entirely, a predator who tortured and killed, then buried the evidence and woke up the next morning to do it all again. The smell that neighbors had occasionally mentioned, the smell they'd accepted his explanations for, now made terrible sense. It wasn't moisture causing mold. It wasn't a sewer problem. It wasn't dead animals under the house. It was 29 human beings decomposing in shallow graves beneath his floor. By December 28, 1978, the forensic team had recovered 27 bodies from the crawlspace. The work was slow, painstaking, horrific. The crawlspace was only about 3 feet high, forcing investigators to work on their hands and knees in cramped, dark, fetid conditions. The smell was overwhelming even with respirators. Many investigators became physically ill during the excavation, had to take breaks to breathe fresh air, had to fight their bodies' instinctive revulsion to continue the grim work. The bodies were in various stages of decomposition. Some were recent, still recognizable as human despite death's damage, their clothing and personal effects intact. Others had been there for years, reduced to skeletal remains, their identities stripped away by time. Some graves held multiple bodies layered on top of each other like firewood, their remains intermingled, making it extraordinarily difficult to determine where one victim ended and another began. Gacy had used every available inch of space, packing bodies in with grim efficiency, creating a three-dimensional puzzle of human remains that would take weeks to fully excavate and catalog. The final count from the crawlspace was 29 bodies, 29 young men and boys whose lives had been stolen, whose families had spent months or years wondering what happened to them. The oldest remains had been there for more than 6 years, buried shortly after Gacy moved into the house in 1972. The newest had been interred just weeks before Robert Pius disappeared, part of the final surge of killings when Gacy's compulsion had spiraled out of control. John Wayne Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978, the same day police began excavating his crawlspace. Initially charged with drug offenses and concealment of death, the charges would be rapidly upgraded as body after body emerged. He was taken to Des Plaines Police Department, his face showing little emotion as he was led past cameras and reporters already gathering outside. For 2 days, Gacy maintained what investigators described as defiant innocence. He sat in interrogation rooms for hours, sometimes cooperative, sometimes belligerent, sometimes breaking down in tears that no one believed were genuine. He claimed he knew nothing about the bodies. Someone else must have put them there. Maybe his employees who had access to the house. Maybe neighborhood boys who'd broken in. Maybe it was a conspiracy to frame him because of his Iowa conviction. He spun increasingly desperate stories that collapsed under minimal scrutiny. But the evidence was overwhelming. The bodies were in his crawlspace, in graves clearly dug over years by someone with regular access. Personal items belonging to missing young men were found throughout his house. Class rings with names engraved inside, driver's licenses, identification cards, wallets, clothing, jewelry. These weren't random possessions. These were trophies, mementos kept deliberately as souvenirs of his victims. Witnesses came forward with devastating testimony. Neighbors reported seeing numerous young men entering Gacy's house over the years, particularly late at night. Some remembered hearing what sounded like screaming or thumping from the house at odd hours, sounds they'd dismissed as television noise or arguments. Employees of PDM contractors described Gacy's pattern of constantly hiring teenage boys and young men, often runaways or kids from troubled backgrounds desperate for work. Several employees reported that coworkers had simply vanished. They'd work for a few weeks, then stop showing up, and Gacy would shrug and say they'd quit or moved on or gone home. Most damning were testimonies from young men who'd survived encounters with Gacy. These survivors told remarkably consistent stories of horror. Gacy would approach them with offers of work or money. He'd invite them to his house to discuss jobs or pick up applications. Once inside, he'd offer alcohol or marijuana, building trust and lowering their guard. Then he'd suggest showing them a magic trick, the handcuff trick. He'd demonstrate on himself first, slipping out easily, then offer to show them how it was done. Once the handcuffs were locked on their wrists, everything changed. The friendly demeanor vanished, the mask dropped, and the true Gacy emerged, cold, cruel, terrifying. He'd tell his captive victims exactly what he planned to do to them. He'd describe in graphic detail how he'd tortured and killed previous victims. He'd watch their terror grow as they realized they were helpless, that no one knew where they were, that screaming wouldn't help. What followed were hours of torture and sexual assault. Gacy seemed to derive pleasure not just from physical violence, but from psychological torture, from watching fear and desperation grow, from having complete power over another human being. Some survivors had escaped only because Gacy passed out drunk before finishing. Others had been released because Gacy worried they'd be missed too quickly. A few had fought back so violently that Gacy decided they weren't worth the trouble. Several survivors had reported their assaults to police at the time, but their reports had gone nowhere. Some had criminal records themselves, which made them seem less credible. Others were runaways with no permanent addresses, easy to dismiss as unreliable, and Gacy, when questioned, had been convincing in his denials. He was a respected businessman, a community leader. Why would anyone believe troubled teenagers over him? The investigations had been perfunctory at best, closing quickly without charges. Now, with bodies emerging from his crawl space, those dismissed reports took on horrifying significance. If early complaints had been investigated thoroughly, if police had connected multiple disappearances to Gacy, how many lives might have been saved? On December 22nd, after more than 24 hours of interrogation, Gacy finally broke. Perhaps he realized the evidence was insurmountable. Perhaps after years of hiding, there was relief in dropping the pretense. Or perhaps he simply couldn't resist talking about what he'd done, receiving recognition for crimes he'd kept secret so long. The confession wasn't tearful or remorseful. It was detailed, methodical, almost clinical. Gacy described his crimes like someone describing a work project, matter-of-factly without emotion, sometimes with apparent pride in his efficiency. He walked investigators through his methodology, how he'd select vulnerable victims who wouldn't be quickly missed, how he'd lure them with job offers, how he'd use the handcuff trick to render them helpless. What came after, he described with detachment that chilled even experienced detectives. He demonstrated his rope trick, the tourniquet method he'd used to strangle most victims, showing exactly how he'd loop rope around their necks and twist it, watching as they suffocated, their struggles weakening until they went still. He explained the crawl space layout in precise detail, pointing out where specific bodies were buried, which graves held multiple victims, how he'd arranged them to maximize limited space. He talked about practical challenges, how difficult it was to dig in the cramped darkness, how much lime he'd used trying to mask the smell, how he'd sometimes had to break bones to make bodies fit when space ran out. The first one was in '72, he said calmly, not long after I moved in. I don't remember his name, just some kid, a hitchhiker. Afterward, I realized I couldn't let him go because he'd report me and I'd violated parole, so I dealt with it. After that, it got easier. You learn things, you get better at it. Easier, better at it. As if murder was a skill to be practiced and refined. Investigators listening couldn't believe his complete lack of remorse, his inability to recognize he'd done anything truly wrong. When asked why, what drove you to kill so many, Gacy's responses shifted constantly. Sometimes he claimed he'd been drunk, that alcohol impaired his judgment. Other times he said work stress had been unbearable, that killings were a release valve. Often he blamed the victims themselves, saying they'd provoked him, threatened him, forced him to defend himself. It was their fault for coming to his house, for accepting his offers, for being so trusting. He showed no empathy for victims or their families. When confronted with specific details, this boy was 14, this one had a mother who never stopped searching, this one had a little sister, Gacy would shrug or look annoyed, as if these were irrelevant emotional manipulations. He maintained that he was in many ways the real victim of his own urges, of society's failure to understand him, of boys who tempted him, of circumstances that had pushed him toward actions he claimed he never wanted to take. Psychiatric evaluators found him fascinating and repellent. He had severe personality disorders, classic antisocial personality disorder, with inability to feel empathy, patterns of manipulation, lack of remorse, tendency to blame others. He was narcissistic, grandiose, convinced of his own importance, even facing murder charges. But crucially, for legal purposes, he wasn't insane in the legal sense. He knew right from wrong. He understood murder was illegal, which was why he'd hidden bodies, cleaned evidence, maintained his respectable persona. He'd been careful and methodical, planning crimes, executing them, covering them up. This wasn't uncontrollable psychosis. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and chose to do it anyway. As bodies were removed one by one, the heartbreaking work of identification began. Each body represented someone's son, brother, friend. Each had a name, a story, a life cut short. But many had been buried so long, decomposed so thoroughly, that giving them back their names would require extensive forensic work. Some victims were identified quickly through dental records or distinctive items. A class ring with a name engraved inside, jewelry a mother recognized immediately, dental work matching records from a family dentist. These identifications brought answers to families who'd spent years wondering, though the answers were the worst possible. The call saying "we found him" was immediately followed by "I'm sorry, but he's deceased," then devastating details of where and how he'd been found. Other identifications took years. Bodies reduced to skeletal remains with no personal items had to be compared against missing person reports from across the region. Investigators tracked down dental records for dozens of missing young men, contacted families who'd filed reports years ago. The forensic technology of 1978 was primitive. DNA testing was in its infancy, expensive and time-consuming. Much identification relied on traditional methods, dental comparisons, skeletal measurements, clothing fiber analysis. 8 victims remained unidentified for decades, known only as victim number followed by their recovery order. These nameless dead became a particular source of frustration. Every victim deserved their name restored, their family notified. But despite extensive efforts, comparing remains against every possible missing person report, these 8 remained anonymous. The youngest identified victim was 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton, a runaway from Chicago's uptown neighborhood living on the streets. He disappeared in 1976. Nobody had looked very hard, just another runaway who'd probably moved on. Except he hadn't. He'd met Gacy, who'd offered money or work or shelter, and ended up buried in that crawl space. The oldest identified victim was 21-year-old Russell Nelson, who disappeared in 1977. Russell wasn't the typical victim profile. He had a job, an apartment, was engaged to be married. But he'd made the fatal mistake of accepting Gacy's offer of better construction pay, had gone to that house to discuss the job, and never left alive. His fiancée had reported him missing immediately, pushed police to investigate, refused to believe he'd abandoned her. She'd been right, but the truth was worse than abandonment. Most victims fell between these extremes, teenagers or young men in their late teens and early 20s, most from troubled backgrounds but not all. They'd been runaways and hitchhikers, kids kicked out for being gay, boys escaping abuse, young men looking for work, drifters passing through Chicago. They were the vulnerable ones, the marginal ones, the boys who existed where predators like Gacy could find them easily. Many had been reported missing, but their cases hadn't been investigated thoroughly. Police reasoned these boys had probably run away voluntarily. They'd turn up eventually, or they wouldn't. The system had failed them twice, first by not protecting them from Gacy, then by not looking hard enough when they vanished. Some families never stopped searching. They'd hired private investigators, distributed flyers, contacted media repeatedly. Now they learned their sons had been dead for years, buried beneath a killer's house while Gacy went to work, entertained children as a clown, presented himself as a pillar of the community. Gacy's trial began February 6, 1980, in Cook County Circuit Court. It became one of the most publicized criminal trials in American history, drawing international attention. The courtroom was packed daily with journalists, cameras, sketch artists, spectators, and victim family members seeking justice. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had Gacy's detailed confession containing information only the killer could know. They had physical evidence, 29 bodies in his crawl space, 4 from the Des Plaines River. They had testimony from surviving victims describing Gacy's methods in painful detail. They had testimony about young men who'd worked for Gacy and vanished. They had forensic evidence linking Gacy to victims through personal items. Guilt was never in question. Gacy's defense team understood arguing innocence was impossible. Their only strategy was an insanity defense, arguing that while Gacy committed the murders, he'd been legally insane, unable to appreciate wrongfulness or control his behavior. If they could prove insanity, he'd be sent to a psychiatric facility instead of prison or death row. The defense called psychiatric experts who testified about Gacy's troubled psychology, his conflicted sexuality, his mental health history. They painted a picture of severe psychological damage from an abusive father, childhood sexual abuse, impossible stress of maintaining a heterosexual facade while attracted to males. They presented him as suffering from multiple personality disorder, arguing he had an alternate personality called Jack, who'd emerge during stress and commit murders, while regular John Gacy was essentially unconscious, in a dissociative state, with no awareness or memory. Under this theory, the real Gacy, the businessman, community leader, children's entertainer, had no knowledge or control over what Jack did. He couldn't be held responsible for murders committed by an alternate personality he couldn't control. He needed psychiatric treatment, not punishment. But prosecution psychiatric experts systematically demolished this defense. Yes, Gacy had personality disorders and psychological issues from childhood trauma, but this didn't equal legal insanity. He didn't have multiple personality disorder in any clinically meaningful sense that required evidence of distinct personalities with different characteristics and memories that simply didn't exist beyond Gacy's self-serving claims. More importantly, Gacy's behavior demonstrated consistent consciousness and intent over years. He'd planned crimes carefully, sometimes grooming victims over days or weeks. He'd taken extensive steps to avoid detection, burying bodies systematically, disposing of evidence methodically, maintaining alibis, cultivating respectability to deflect suspicion. He'd continued killing for 6 years, adapting methods as needed, solving problems, managing disposal challenges. This showed deliberate conscious behavior rather than uncontrolled episodes. Most damning, Gacy had confessed in extensive detail, describing not just what he'd done but why and how, explaining victim selection and disposal methods. Those confessions revealed someone who remembered crimes and understood his actions. He'd expressed regret not about killings but about getting caught, about leaving evidence, about planning mistakes. This wasn't someone who didn't understand. This was someone who understood perfectly and wished he'd done it better. The jury heard testimony that was almost unbearable. Surviving victims described hours of torture, being told how previous victims died, being certain they'd be killed. Family members described years of searching, not knowing, hoping their sons might be alive, then learning the truth was worse than anything imagined. Photographs of the crime scene showed the crawl space, excavated graves, remains being removed. Jurors had to confront the physical reality, bodies stacked like firewood, Gacy living above while corpses rotted below. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Every day brought new horrors, new details making the incomprehensible somehow worse. The public followed obsessively through news coverage. This wasn't just local news, it was national and international, a case crystallizing fears about hidden evil, about how predators could operate unseen, about vulnerability of marginalized youth. On March 13, 1980, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts. Guilty on 33 counts of murder. Guilty on all charges. The deliberation speed suggested little doubt. Evidence was overwhelming. Defense arguments unpersuasive. The courtroom erupted. Family members wept with relief, with renewed grief, with satisfaction that justice would be done. Some shouted in triumph. Others sat silently, too overwhelmed to react. Gacy showed no emotion, sitting expressionless as if the verdict concerned someone else. The penalty phase began immediately. Under Illinois law, death penalty was available for multiple murders. Prosecutors argued forcefully that Gacy deserved death. He'd killed 33 people, tortured them, shown no remorse, buried them like garbage. He was a predator who'd kill again if given opportunity. No rehabilitation was possible. The defense argued for life imprisonment instead. Death was too easy. Let Gacy spend life in a cell, thinking about his crimes, suffering as victims suffered, growing old in prison, experiencing slow death rather than quick execution. But the jury wasn't persuaded. On March 21, 1980, they sentenced Gacy to death for 12 murders, the maximum under Illinois law. He'd also serve concurrent life sentences for the other 21, ensuring he'd never leave prison alive, even if death sentences were overturned. Gacy was sent to Menard Correctional Center to await execution. He spent 14 years on death row, filing appeals, giving interviews, creating paintings he'd sell to collectors for thousands of dollars. Many paintings depicted clowns, including self-portraits as Pogo. The fact that Gacy profited from his infamy infuriated victim families. Even on death row, Gacy maintained various forms of innocence depending on audience and mood. Sometimes claiming he didn't remember murders, they'd happened during blackouts. Other times suggesting others were responsible, that employees had killed and buried bodies without his knowledge. Occasionally admitting killings, but claiming provocation or self-defense. His story shifted constantly, contradicting itself, adapting to whatever seemed useful. Appeals dragged on 14 years, as typical in capital cases. Every trial aspect was challenged: jury selection, evidence rulings, psychiatric testimony, death penalty constitutionality. Each appeal was denied, each challenge rejected, but the process took years. Victim families lived with knowledge that Gacy remained alive, breathing, eating, creating paintings, giving interviews, while their sons remained dead and voiceless. Finally, after 14 years and exhausted appeals, May 10, 1994 arrived. At Stateville Correctional Center, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. He was 52, having spent exactly a third of his life on death row. His last meal was Kentucky Fried Chicken, darkly fitting given he'd managed KFC restaurants before his first conviction, plus shrimp, strawberries, and Diet Coke. His final words: "Kiss my ass." No apology, no remorse, no acknowledgement of 33 stolen lives. No comfort for families who'd suffered, just defiance and contempt, indicating even facing death, Gacy thought only of himself, felt only anger at punishment, incapable to the end of recognizing anyone's humanity but his own. Outside, crowds gathered. Some supported the death penalty, holding signs saying Gacy deserved to die. Others protested capital punishment on principle. Family members stood in quiet vigil, hoping his death might bring closure, though many would say it didn't. Nothing could close wounds his crimes had opened. When news came that execution was complete, some cheered. Others wept. Many stood silently, feeling empty and exhausted by years of grief and anger with no adequate outlet. One victim's father said quietly, "My son has been dead 17 years. Gacy being dead doesn't bring him back. But at least now he can't hurt anyone else. That's something, I guess." The house at 8213 West Summerdale was demolished April 1979, months after bodies were discovered. The structure was razed completely, contaminated crawlspace soil removed. The lot remained empty for years. Nobody wanted to build where so much death had occurred. The address itself became infamous. Eventually a new house was built, Though the address was changed, new owners reported no paranormal activity, despite local belief the ground must be cursed. The case transformed law enforcement's approach to serial killers and missing persons. Before Gacy, many departments didn't take runaway disappearances seriously. Low-priority cases, kids who'd probably turn up or wouldn't but weren't worth major resources. After Gacy, after revelation that one killer had murdered 33 over 6 years, while police had unconnected reports, attitudes changed. The case led to better interjurisdictional coordination, improved missing persons databases, allowing pattern searches across boundaries, more thorough investigation even of vulnerable populations. Departments recognized that multiple similar disappearances might indicate a serial predator rather than unrelated cases. It also raised disturbing questions about protecting vulnerable youth. Almost all Gacy's victims came from society's margins, runaways, street kids, some involved in survival sex work. Boys existing outside protective structures of family and community, easy prey because few were looking out for them, whose disappearances didn't trigger alarm because society had already written them off. Gacy exploited this ruthlessly, understanding he could kill these boys without immediate investigation, that their deaths would be noticed slower and mourned less than victims from privileged backgrounds. This raised uncomfortable questions we still struggle with. Why weren't these disappearances taken seriously? Why did it take Robert Peast's disappearance, a boy from a stable family with parents who immediately pushed for investigation, to finally bring Gacy down when so many previous victims vanished with minimal follow-up? What does it say about our values that we invest more in finding missing children from affluent families than in protecting poor, troubled, gay, or homeless kids? The killer clown moniker the media attached to Gacy, while sensational, somewhat missed the point. Gacy didn't kill while dressed as a clown. He didn't use pogo to lure victims. His targets were teenage boys and young men, not children he entertained. Pogo was simply another mask, another facet of respectable identity. The real horror wasn't clown makeup. It was the man beneath, the successful businessman using respectability as camouflage, understanding that friendly smiles and community service deflected suspicion even when complaints and disappearances should have triggered investigation. Decades later, his case continues to fascinate and horrify. Countless books, documentaries, podcasts analyze his crimes, psychology, methodology. Researchers study him as an example of personality disorders and criminal patterns. His paintings remain valuable collector's items despite questionable artistic merit. Slowly, forensic advances have given names back to unidentified victims. DNA technology that didn't exist in 1978 has been used to compare genetic material from remains against samples from missing persons' families. Genealogical databases have become powerful identification tools, allowing investigators to construct family trees and identify individuals matching unknown victims' characteristics. Jimmy Hackinson's identification in 2017, nearly 40 years after murder, brought closure to his family, but highlighted how many families never got closure, never learned what happened, spent lives wondering. Francis Wayne Alexander's identification in 2021, 46 years after death, demonstrated that even after nearly half a century, it remained possible to restore stolen identities. As of 2024, all but one victim has been identified, 32 names restored, but victim number 19 remains unknown, reminding us that even with technological advances, some mysteries remain unsolved. Someone's son is buried under a marker reading victim number 19 inches because no one knows his real name, no one has claimed him, no one is looking anymore if anyone ever did. He remains the final silent witness to how easy it was for young men to disappear, how many boys were so isolated that even mass media coverage didn't bring anyone forward who recognized them. The story of John Wayne Gacy is ultimately about how evil can hide behind normalcy and respectability, about how predators don't always announce themselves, don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they're successful businessmen, community leaders, volunteers who entertain sick children. Sometimes they're the helpful neighbor who seems genuinely nice. It's about how society fails the vulnerable, how we write off certain people as disposable, how we accept disappearances without investigating thoroughly. It's about how systemic failures in missing persons investigations, in cooperation between jurisdictions, in taking complaints from marginalized victims seriously, can allow serial predators to operate for years, killing dozens while the system looks away. And it's about enduring pain of loss, of families who searched for decades, who never stopped hoping, who finally learned truths worse than anything imagined. 33 young men and boys lost their lives. 33 futures stolen, 33 families shattered, 33 lights extinguished. Their names deserve remembering, their lives honoring, their stories telling, not as footnotes to Gacy's infamy, but as individuals who mattered, who were loved, who should still be alive. They were sons and brothers and friends. They had dreams and hopes and plans. They deserved to grow old, fall in love, build careers, have families, make their marks. Instead, they became victims of a man who saw them only as objects, whose deaths meant nothing beyond brief satisfaction. That is the true horror, not the clown costume or sensational headlines, but the utter absence of humanity, the complete inability to recognize other people as fully human and deserving of life. John Wayne Gacy is dead, but the damage lives on, in families still grieving, in survivors still bearing trauma, in that one unidentified victim, in cautionary lessons about how evil operates and how society must protect the vulnerable. His legacy is pain, loss, and the terrible reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters, that behind painted smiles might hide darkness most of us don't want to believe could exist. But it did exist. It killed 33 times, and only by understanding how it operated, how it hid, how it destroyed, can we hope to recognize such evil if it appears again. Because it will appear again, in different forms with different masks, hiding in plain sight as Gacy did. The story of John Wayne Gacy is a warning. Look closer, trust carefully, protect the vulnerable. Never forget that the most dangerous predators are often the ones you'd never suspect.